Their farms were grabbed under Robert Mugabe's land reforms. Now, white farmers in Zimbabwe will be compensated. But they say that's not enough. So, will their demands trigger another crisis? And has land reform proved a success in Zimbabwe? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Thousands of white farmers in Zimbabwe were forced off their land during former President Robert Mugabe's rule. But they might now be awarded some compensation. The government says it plans to pay more than $50 million to those who were evicted. But critics estimate the bill at $9 billion. Matyszak has this report from the town of Chegutu.
Ben Fried says returning to the farm that was seized from his family 9 years ago is difficult. He's distraught to see the farmhouse in such a state and doubts Zimbabwe's government will keep its promise to pay $53 million to compensate former white commercial farmers.
I believe what is happening is government is trying to make the right noises in order for the international community to come in behind them and say, we're prepared to put money into this. But they're not serious about it.
The compensation is for improvements made to the farms, such as dams and tobacco barns. But farmers who lost everything say $53 million is nowhere near enough. It's estimated Zimbabwe's cash-strapped government needs at least $9 billion to compensate 4,000 displaced white farmers.
Government will find ways of raising the much-needed funding. It might take a bit of time, but a way has to be found because they rightfully deserve to be compensated for the improvements.
Compensating whites is not popular with some black war veterans who helped force the farmers out. The vets say much of the good land went to senior officials in the ruling ZANU-PF party.
I just feel it's very, very unfair because I don't have land at the moment. And other comrades, lots of comrades, they don't have land. So for white farmers to be compensated, I feel, it's an insult.
The Commercial Farmers Union says several farms are overgrown with weeds and wild grass. On this land, the sunflowers, maize and mangoes that were once here are long gone. This used to be a 4-bedroomed house, and this was the kitchen. The taps were over there. They've been removed. People who came here took the tiles and the sinks and whatever bricks they could find. The house traced all the way back there. That used to be the lounge and the living room. For Ben Fried, compensation, if it happens, is not enough. He says property rights and the rule of law have to be respected. Otherwise, history will keep repeating itself. Matyszak, Al Jazeera, Chegutu, Zimbabwe.
Well, let's take a look at Zimbabwe's land reform policies. The first effort to distribute land more fairly was started in 1980. That's when Zimbabwe gained independence from white minority rule. At that time, the majority of arable land was owned by white farmers. The plan was based on a willing seller, willing buyer policy, which meant the government would not force the sale of land. But in 2000, a new phase was introduced to accelerate the process, and land was seized from white farmers. It was envisaged that 50,000 square kilometres would be subject to compulsory purchases from whites over 5 years. Zimbabwe's experience was often compared to South Africa's. Both countries share a history of land ownership inequality. Let's bring our guests into the show now. We have joining us from Harare by Skype, Matyszak, senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria. In Nairobi is Aly Khan Satchu, CEO of Rich Management and an emerging markets economist. And from London, Joseph Ochieno, a commentator on African affairs and former columnist for New Africa magazine. Good to have you all with us. If I could start with Joseph. So is the Zimbabwean government's land reform policy a positive thing, a much needed policy, much needed by the country and the economy?
Absolutely, and in my opinion, the acceleration needed to have taken place not in 2000 but much earlier. But I think we need to put this in context, including Haru's report. It is the case, as the introduction rightly suggested, that the process started in 1980. Land was the cause of the fight for independence in Zimbabwe at the core and at the center. What happened was, when the stalemate arrived, the Lancaster House Agreement provided for, one, that while war ended and they went through a democratic process, the land would be redistributed on willing seller, willing buyer. And what would happen is that the guarantors of that process, led by Britain, would provide the funds to be able to do just that. The thing is that the British and others, their allies, failed to honor their commitments because of politics. Going back towards the year 2000, I mean, 1990, 1995, 96, 97 particularly.
Oh, okay, but Joseph, before we go back into too much historical depth of analysis, what I want to do is to focus on now. Your overall feeling is this is a land reform policy that is positive for the country and the economy, right? That's your sentiment.
Land reform is an imperative. The context is important because, as we're saying, and I think as part of your report suggests, right. Yes, the compensation process at the moment, Zimbabwe needs money. Most of the Africans in Zimbabwe still need land, including the lady in that clip. What the Zimbabwean government needs to do is to make sure that, one, people who lost their land unfairly, white people who lost their land unfairly, be given to them. And indeed, there was a lot of corruption in the process. But to suggest that you steal my car and then I pay you back for servicing it is neither here nor there.
All right, let's bring Derek into it. Do you agree, overall, this has been a positive thing, a much-needed policy for the country, even if some of the details need to be sorted out about how much compensation needs to be paid?
Well, you need to look at land reform policy as to what was happening in 2000 and what was happening in 1980 and what's happening at present. What's happening at present is certainly there's a need to revisit the issue around compensation for land. But most importantly, the most important policy which is required at the moment is to provide secure tenure for land so that those land leases are transferable and what's called bankable here. In 2000, there wasn't actually a land reform policy. What was taking place in 2000 has to be viewed in the political context, where the land grab that took place in 2000 was more about the retention of power by ZANU-PF than actually what later became the fast-track land reform program.
Okay, so maybe politically expedient. Economically, though, Aly, at the end of the day, from an economic perspective, what has the land reform policy, what sort of impact has it had on the agricultural sector, on the economy?
So the first point to note is that Zimbabwe historically was a breadbasket. Its agricultural production was enormous. It was able to feed its country and many of the countries around it. And in the last few years, we've seen a significant deterioration in production. So the issue is, how do you get back to a fully functioning, productive agricultural sector?
Are we not seeing that in some sectors, Aly? Forgive me for interrupting, but let me bring you the argument from the supporters of the government who would say maize production, for example, in 2017 is the highest in 2 decades. Tobacco production, another success story, they say, that's at $576 million worth of it produced in 2017. How can we say it's been deteriorating in the last few years?
Well, it's statistics, isn't it? You're comparing it to 2 decades ago. 2 decades ago was, as far as I can remember, 1997 or 1998. So it depends where you go back towards. But I think if you look at it, you cannot argue that the agricultural sector in Zimbabwe is as productive as it can be. So I think one's got to look at it and admit that. Once we have that admission, we can then work forward and say, how do we get it back to where it could be? And I think what President Mnangagwa is trying to do with this $52 million compensation is thread a needle. He's trying to open up. He's trying to refinance. He's trying to reopen Zimbabwe to the global economy. And in order to do that, he's got to make some kind of gesture of restitution. And I think that's what he's seeking to do. The problem in Zimbabwe, of course, is you've got a Mickey Mouse currency, you've got a situation which cannot go on. It's practically Venezuelan in terms of the currency, and I don't know how he's going to square this circle. It becomes very, very populist, Sami. You know, the idea that I know there's a historic wrong. We all know there's a historic wrong. But essentially, by grabbing the land and giving it to people who are not competent but well-positioned with the ruling elite is simply not going to deliver a thriving agricultural sector.
You made some good points.
What President Mnangagwa is trying to do...
Hang on there, Aly. You've made some really good points. I want to take them to Joseph. So the sort of sentiment, I guess, from an economist perspective there, would you agree with that, that this policy hasn't been a success? I mean, a Mickey Mouse currency, as Aly said, you know, the inflation, the fact that it's gone from being the breadbasket to a sector that's just struggling to try and get to former productivity levels.
Well, I suggested this before at the peak of the campaigns for democratic reforms in Africa, that once upon a time, apartheid South Africa was the most powerful economy on the continent. That does not mean that apartheid was right. No, quite clearly, the land reform process, you know, other than the land grab as a political language, is a necessity. The issue is really, we also need to look at Zimbabwe today as a matter of reality, and where I totally agree. Yes, this 52 million is a gesture. It's a gesture to show that the present government is different from that of Robert Mugabe. Absolutely fair, absolutely sensible. It has to be supported. I think this government needs to be supported to simply say that, yes, you're giving an element of a gesture. What can we do? What lessons can we learn? But I think if some of the tones of the conversation is such that we must go back to where the argument was between 1997 and the year 2000, we're actually going back to square zero. And we're going back to square zero in a risky way, in a manner in which the whites,
I think,
you know,
Aly's point might be
happy.
it actually, we're going back to a more productive era, is what he's trying to say, I think.
We need to recognize that the situation, the status quo that it was not right. The fact that Zimbabwe was a breadbasket, you know, is no dispute. But it was a breadbasket in which the vast majority of the Zimbabwean people, the vast majority of the citizens of Zimbabwe, African Zimbabweans, whose land were actually literally grabbed by force and in many other ways rather brutally, you know, did not have the land. The question is, how fair has this process been? I totally agree. There has been corruption. There's been nepotism in the process. And I think this government talked about land reform, land audit process in the last 12 months. I would like to know from them how well and how successful that has gone. And that's why I also suggest that for the white people whose land were taken unreasonably and unfairly and grabbed by people, rather illegally, oh yes, that must return. But part of the process was that the Zimbabwean, it was literally a situation of war in the last 10, 15 years.
Okay. Let me give Aly a chance to come back in on this one briefly, because I interrupted him. So is it good enough to look back and say, well, it was the breadbasket, if it was the breadbasket for a minority of people who were benefiting?
Well, you know, I look at it in the national interest, and it's in Zimbabwe's national interest to produce as much food as is possible in order to feed their people. And if you look at it, this obsession, it's a little bit like Trump's wall. You know, I appreciate that this land was grabbed unfairly, but, you know, that was then. We can't do anything about it now. What can we do now? We have to put accomplished farmers on the land to maximize the output and therefore feed our people. But if we go around telling people, all of you can get a quarter acre or a half acre because it was stolen from you, it's just not going to work. And I think it's a very circular argument. Everybody goes back to 1980, apartheid. You know, 95% of Africans are a born-free generation. They deserve better than these regurgitated arguments about history. Feed our people. Give them opportunity, but it's not going to happen by slicing land up and saying, here's a quarter acre, here's restitution. And I think that's where the political argument is failing our citizens entirely. And the same thing's happening in South Africa. Rwanda, interestingly, I saw in the last 2 days, President Kagame's taken the land back because he's realized it's not working. So I think we've got to get beyond this historical story. It is real, it happened. happened. But what is the situation now? The situation now is Zimbabwe has the potential to feed itself and the potential to feed a lot of countries around it. And that's what they should be working on.
I know for sure Joseph is going to have something to say about all of that. But before we come back to Joseph, I want to go to Derek again and say, you know, the point that you made about basically stabilizing land ownership rights. Is the government's current policy of, I think, is it $53 million compensation package, is that a step in the right direction?
Well, what I've seen from the conversation so far is that a lot of the politics is being airbrushed out of the discourse. If I could just go back a little bit to the previous discussion, there was a conversation as to why no land reform had taken place up until the year 2000. There was a reason for that. Mugabe was very aware that Zimbabwe was an agro-based economy, and that agro-based economy was being driven largely by white farming and also by industry downstream from that white farming. There was an unspoken agreement with the white farmers: you stay out of politics and you can keep the land. When the whites got involved in politics, that's when the land invasion started. The Zimbabwean economy immediately began declining by 10% per annum after those invasions took place. At a time when there was a regional economic boom driven by commodity prices and other economies were expanding by about 10%, the Zimbabwean economy collapsed by 10% per annum. So those land invasions, it was not a land reform program. It was simply a mechanism by which ZANU-PF sought to stay in power. And the economy suffered enormously from that and has yet to recover from that. You mentioned that tobacco is picking up. It is picking up, but at an enormous environmental cost. There's deforestation taking place to cure the tobacco. There's child labor. There's children suffering from nicotine poison, etc. It's not a success story. It's not a pretty picture. Yes, 2017 was a good year for maize because we had phenomenal rains that year, which are unlikely to be repeated.
Was it only the rains? So, the supporters of the government say, of course, it was also the government's command agriculture policy as well played a role in that.
Yes, that played a part. But the command agriculture policies would have failed dismally had it not been for the phenomenal rains that were received over that year.
Okay, I could see it at a moment ago. Sorry, I'll come back to you in a moment, Derek, but I could see Joseph was shaking his head, I take it, in disagreement, and he probably has something to come back with. Go ahead, Joseph.
You know, Tiny Rowlands, who did very good business, good in quotes, in Southern Africa, Ted Heath, the British Prime Minister, called him the ugly face of capitalism. The Chinese would argue that in as long as we inject $10 billion into a village, it does not matter in whose hands it is. No, I think these are simplistic arguments. And the other thing is the risks are this, that we actually airbrush these processes. It's not true that the problems in Zimbabwe started in the year 2000. And I'm lucky to have been a party to following many of these other things closely from a distance and from close. No, it is the case that the failure of the settlement from 1980 was a result of this thing. When about the year 1997, when Mugabe felt and believed that he was being pushed to do it the British way, is when this thing all failed, and this from 1997. By the year 2000, Mugabe was simply saying, and I'm not supporting Mugabe on this argument, I'm not speaking for him. Mugabe simply said that, look, you guys refused, you failed to honor the agreements of 1980, we are going to do it the Zimbabwean way. What did he do? He decided to do it the majority Zimbabwean way. And yes, a number of whites lost us in this process. Let's make sure that we compensate the whites who lost in this process. But Zimbabwe cannot be Zimbabwe as a nation for a privileged few. It has to be a country for all Zimbabwean people. And you know what? The more we airbrush this, the more people down the road in South Africa
are they doing it the right way, Joseph?
Land reform in South Africa is more popular
if it's
today
done
than it
through
was 10 years ago.
land grabs and that is not addressed properly, that's an issue, isn't it? That's going to cause instability.
It simply led to, it became violent when it became political. It became violent when the allies decided to make it a Mugabe issue. And yes, of course, Mugabe was playing politics.
Right.
But immediately the allies, withdrew Mugabe decided to do it their way. And also, it is the case that the allies used some Zimbabweans, and this is known.
All right, I think we're focusing a lot on the past. I want to bring Derek in because he's shaking his head. But if we can try and look to the present, because we can read history any way we want. But is the government now, through its land audit policy, is it fixing some of the shortcomings of the whole land reform process? They're saying they're going to take off the land from incompetent farmers or cronies who haven't really worked the land. They're going to look into people who have multiple farms that shouldn't have, and so on and so forth. Is that good enough, Derek?
Well, again, one needs to look at the political context here. A lot has been made of the fact that the Mnangagwa administration says they're going to set aside this $53 million for land compensation. But again, that's politicking. The Mnangagwa government is anxious to show that property rights are now being respected, and this compensation for land, or for rather improvements on the land, is part and parcel of that apparently newfound respect for property rights. But one needs to bear in mind that the Constitution has always required compensation to be paid for improvements on the land. And under the Mugabe government, $42.7 million had already been paid to white farmers. 43 white farmers had been compensated for improvements before the Mnangagwa administration came in. So this policy of $53 million, it's not a new policy, but It's being hyped up in order to try and emphasize the Mnangagwa government's commitment to property rights, etc.
All right.
Certainly, we've now had a land reform commission formed, but people are quite skeptical about what will come out of that commission's investigation.
Process. All right, we've got a couple of minutes left. I want to try and get Aly in. From an economist perspective, then, looking forward, is there an important thing we're forgetting to mention here? Can the agricultural sector develop, whatever changes domestically or internally are made, without addressing the problem of sanctions?
That's an interesting question. I mean, my suggestion would be, if we're looking into the future, is to try and keep these farms intact, bring competent people on them who can farm the land, maybe do a structure where,
is that what's happening,
do you
think,
a
Aly?
fund, profits are shared and distributed, and that's distributed amongst the people. Because if you're just going to put up, if you're going to say to yourself, let's stick everybody on the land and see what happens, nothing's going to happen. And just a final point, Mnangagwa is trying to thread a needle here. He needs to find a lot of cash to reignite this economy. He hasn't found it yet. If he doesn't find it, he's going the way of Bashir in Sudan. So I think it's a political
what he's
gesture.
Doing in
the
terms
number
of
is not important.
The audit
it's
policy,
a signal.
Is his audit policy doing that, at least in the first point which you made, which is you don't want farms in the hands of people who can't do anything productive with it?
I think he's trying to do it. If I look at the continuum in Africa, I don't think he's done enough. I don't think he's been bold enough. I think he's talked the talk, but he hasn't walked it. And until we see that happen, I don't see the recovery happening in Zimbabwe.
All right, we've got a final minute. Let me give it to Joseph then. Is the government effort to engage countries which are imposing sanctions, like the US, failing since we saw, for example, I think it was December the 20th, a new round of US penalties imposed?
Yeah, I think I told this program in a different context that actually that's unfortunate that the Western allies have not sufficiently responded to this government. And it's actually fairly true that, yes, maybe this $53 million may be hyped partly as a result of that. But the quick point I need to say is this, that actually it would be very unreasonable and unfair for us to suggest that Africans who are landless, are incompetent when there is no evidence that they've had the opportunity to farm without doing that. Because other than Zimbabwe and South Africa, my native Uganda, we've done rather well without necessarily having specialist agricultural input from specialist farmers.
All right, I'm sure Aly would have something to say about Ugandans giving the land back. He made that point earlier, but I think we're going to have to leave the discussion there for now and thank all of our guests for coming in and sharing their insights, Derek, Aly and Joseph. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami, Zeidan, and the whole team here. For now, is goodbye.